A molecular biologist sits in a windowless interrogation room, separated from her phone, her research, and any connection to the outside world. Dr. Rebecca Chun has just been detained by federal agents who've confiscated 8 years of groundbreaking research on environmental contamination. Research that was about to expose how a major corporation, with government complicity, had been poisoning communities while regulatory agencies looked the other way. The agents tell her the detention is routine questioning related to national security. But Rebecca knows the truth. She's being silenced because her findings threaten to expose a cover-up that reached the highest levels of power. What the agents didn't know was that 3 hours before they arrived at her lab, Rebecca had sent an encrypted message to a colleague containing every document, every data point, and every piece of evidence she'd compiled. That message, which would eventually leak to journalists and trigger one of the biggest environmental scandals in American history, contained a simple subject line that would become a rallying cry for scientific integrity. If you're reading this, they've already come for me. This isn't a conspiracy theory or a fictional thriller. This is the true story of how one scientist's courage exposed a systematic cover-up and why what happened to her should terrify anyone who believes truth matters more than profit. Let me take you back 18 months before that detention, because understanding what Rebecca Chun discovered requires knowing the scientific journey that led her to findings that powerful interests desperately wanted buried. Rebecca was a tenured professor at UC Berkeley specializing in environmental toxicology, with a particular focus on how industrial pollutants affected human health across generations. She'd built her reputation on rigorous, methodical research that couldn't be dismissed or discredited easily. Peer-reviewed publications in top journals, collaborations with respected institutions, and a track record of scientific integrity that made her work essentially bulletproof under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. Rebecca's research had started innocuously enough, as part of a broader study on water quality in California's Central Valley, an agricultural region that produced much of America's fruits and vegetables, while simultaneously dealing with serious contamination issues from decades of industrial farming and manufacturing. What Rebecca found in those initial water samples was concerning but not shocking: elevated levels of various pollutants including pesticides, heavy metals, and industrial solvents. This was unfortunately common in agricultural regions where regulatory oversight had been lax and where corporate interests often took precedence over environmental protection. But when Rebecca began analyzing health records from communities in the affected areas, she noticed patterns that didn't match the expected outcomes from the known contaminants. Cancer rates were significantly higher than national averages, but not just any cancers. Specific types that were associated with exposure to particular chemical compounds that shouldn't have been present in those communities at all. Birth defects, neurological disorders, and autoimmune diseases were all occurring at rates that couldn't be explained by the documented pollution. Something else was in the water, something that wasn't being tested for, something that someone had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. Rebecca expanded her study, collecting samples from multiple communities and analyzing them with more sophisticated testing methods than the standard environmental assessments used by regulatory agencies. What she discovered was staggering. A class of synthetic chemicals called polyfluorinated compounds, commonly known as PFAS or forever chemicals, were present at levels hundreds of times higher than what was considered safe. PFAS are called forever chemicals because they don't break down in the environment or in human bodies, accumulating over time and causing serious health problems including cancer, thyroid disease, and developmental issues in children. These chemicals had been used for decades in everything from non-stick cookware to firefighting foam to industrial processes, and their dangers had been known to manufacturers since at least the 1970s. But here's where Rebecca's research became dangerous to powerful interests. The levels she was finding and the specific compounds she was identifying could only have come from deliberate industrial discharge that should have been stopped decades ago under existing environmental regulations. Rebecca traced the contamination to its source, a chemical manufacturing plant operated by a Fortune 500 company called Vanguard Chemical Industries, which had been producing PFAS compounds and related chemicals since the 1960s. The plant had a long history of environmental violations, but those violations had been treated as minor infractions with small fines that were essentially just the cost of doing business for a corporation making billions in annual profit. What Rebecca's research showed was that Vanguard hadn't just been accidentally polluting. They'd been deliberately dumping toxic waste into waterways, had known about the health consequences for decades, and had worked systematically to suppress evidence, manipulate studies, and capture regulatory agencies that were supposed to be protecting public health. Rebecca found internal company documents that had been leaked by a former employee, documents showing that Vanguard's own scientists had warned leadership about the dangers of PFAS contamination as early as 1978, and that leadership had made a conscious decision to continue operations while hiding evidence of harm. But the story got worse. As Rebecca dug deeper into the regulatory history, she discovered that the Environmental Protection Agency and California's Department of Environmental Protection had received complaints about Vanguard's contamination for years, had conducted their own testing that confirmed dangerous levels of pollutants, and had then, inexplicably, failed to take meaningful enforcement action. Files that should have been public record had been classified or destroyed. Whistleblowers within the agencies had been reassigned or forced out. And most damningly, Rebecca found evidence of coordination between Vanguard executives and senior government officials to suppress research findings, manipulate public health data, and discredit scientists who raised concerns. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance. It was systemic corruption involving regulatory capture at the highest levels, where the agencies meant to protect public health had instead become protectors of corporate profit regardless of human cost. Rebecca understood the implications of what she'd found, and she knew the risks of going public with research that threatened both a major corporation and government agencies. She'd seen what happened to other environmental scientists who'd challenged powerful interests: careers destroyed, reputations smeared, research funding eliminated, and in some cases, even physical threats. According to a 2021 study published in the journal Science and Engineering Ethics, approximately 40% of environmental scientists working on politically sensitive topics report experiencing some form of suppression, censorship, or professional retaliation for their research. Rebecca had tenure, which provided some protection, but she knew that wouldn't be enough if Vanguard and their government allies decided to come after her seriously. So she took precautions. She documented everything, created encrypted backups of all her data, established a network of colleagues who could continue her work if something happened to her, and most importantly, she prepared a dead man's switch, an insurance policy in the form of that encrypted message that would automatically distribute her findings if she was prevented from doing so herself. Rebecca's research was scheduled to be published in Environmental Health Perspectives, one of the field's most prestigious journals, after completing peer review. The paper was titled Systematic Contamination and Regulatory Failure, a case study of PFAS pollution in California's Central Valley, and it was devastating in its implications. The paper didn't just document contamination. It traced the chain of knowledge and decisions that had allowed it to continue for decades, named specific officials who'd suppressed evidence, and estimated that Vanguard's pollution had caused thousands of preventable cancers and other diseases while generating billions in profit that they'd never had to pay in cleanup costs or victim compensation. 2 weeks before the scheduled publication, Rebecca was contacted by a lawyer representing Vanguard Chemical Industries. The lawyer's message was professionally threatening. They claimed Rebecca's research was defamatory, that her methodology was flawed, and that publication would result in immediate litigation for damages. They offered her a deal: withdraw the paper, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and accept a research grant from Vanguard worth $2 million. Rebecca declined within an hour. 3 days after Rebecca rejected Vanguard's offer, she received a visit at her lab from 2 men identifying themselves as agents from the Department of Homeland Security. They claimed they were investigating potential threats to critical infrastructure and needed to review her research related to water systems and chemical facilities. Rebecca, knowing her rights and understanding that this was likely an intimidation tactic, asked to see a warrant or subpoena. The agents said they were conducting a voluntary interview and that she wasn't legally required to comply, but they strongly suggested cooperation would be in her best interest. Rebecca politely declined and asked them to leave her lab, which they did, but not before one of them said something that was clearly meant as a warning. "Dr. Chun, sometimes the pursuit of truth can have unintended consequences. We'd hate to see your important career derailed by poor judgment." That veiled threat was the confirmation Rebecca needed that her research had hit a nerve at levels far beyond a single corporation. Rebecca spent the next week preparing for what she knew was coming. She contacted the ACLU, Environmental Defense Fund, and several investigative journalists, providing them with background information and telling them that if anything happened to her or if her research was suppressed, they should investigate why. She gave copies of her data to trusted colleagues with instructions to make everything public if she was unable to do so. She recorded a video statement explaining her findings and the pressure she'd been under to stay silent. And she finalized that encrypted message, comprehensive documentation of everything she'd found, along with evidence of the intimidation attempts and the network of officials who'd been complicit in the cover-up. The message was set to automatically send to 20 recipients, including journalists, lawyers, and other scientists if she failed to enter a security code every 48 hours. It was insurance, but Rebecca hoped she'd never need to use it. On a Tuesday morning in March 2023, Rebecca arrived at her lab to find it surrounded by federal agents. They had a warrant, signed by a judge, claiming that Rebecca's research involved classified information related to national security and that her materials needed to be seized as part of a counterintelligence investigation. The warrant was vague enough to be nearly meaningless. It cited statutes related to protection of critical infrastructure and classified information, but it didn't specify what information in Rebecca's research was supposedly classified or why her environmental toxicology work would constitute a national security threat. Rebecca's university colleagues who witnessed the raid were stunned. Tenured professors conducting peer-reviewed environmental research don't typically get raided by federal agents unless something has gone terribly wrong with the relationship between scientific inquiry and political power. Rebecca was detained, not arrested, which meant she was being held for questioning without formal charges, a legal gray area that allowed authorities to separate her from legal counsel and her support network while claiming she wasn't actually in custody. Here's what the agents who detained Rebecca didn't know. 3 hours before they'd arrived at her lab, Rebecca had failed to enter her security code. She'd seen the suspicious vehicles outside her apartment that morning, had recognized the signs of imminent action against her, and had made the conscious decision not to reset her dead man switch. The encrypted message began its automatic distribution at 7 a.m. By the time Rebecca was sitting in that interrogation room at 10:30 a.m., her research and evidence of the cover-up were already in the hands of 20 people who knew exactly what to do with it. The agents questioning Rebecca asked about her research funding sources, her communications with foreign nationals, standard questions designed to suggest she might be a security threat. But Rebecca wasn't answering. She'd requested legal counsel and refused to answer questions until her lawyer was present, which was her constitutional right even though she was supposedly not under arrest. While Rebecca sat in detention, her dead man switch was triggering a sequence of events that would ultimately vindicate her research and expose the cover-up she'd documented. Journalists at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and ProPublica received the encrypted files and began verifying their contents. Environmental lawyers at multiple organizations started reviewing the evidence of regulatory failures and corporate wrongdoing. Scientists at other institutions began replicating Rebecca's testing protocols to confirm her findings. And most importantly, the public was beginning to learn about the systematic poisoning of communities and the coordinated effort to suppress the truth. By the time Rebecca was released from detention 12 hours later, her university having finally mobilized legal resources and media attention that made continued detention politically untenable, her research was already making headlines, and the cover-up she'd exposed was unraveling. The leaked documents that Rebecca's dead man switch distributed were damning in their specificity and scope. Internal Vanguard chemical emails showed executives joking about regulatory agencies being in our pocket and discussing strategies to neutralize scientists whose research threatened their operations. Communications between company lawyers and government officials revealed coordinated efforts to classify environmental data as security-sensitive to prevent public disclosure. Meeting minutes from EPA leadership showed conscious decisions to delay enforcement actions against Vanguard despite clear evidence of ongoing contamination. And perhaps most troubling, the documents showed a pattern of government scientists being pressured to alter findings, delay publications, and avoid conclusions that would create liability for corporate polluters. This wasn't just one company breaking environmental laws. It was systematic corruption of the regulatory process that was supposed to protect public health. The public response to Rebecca's leaked research was immediate and intense. Communities in California's Central Valley who'd been experiencing elevated cancer rates and health problems finally had scientific explanation and documentation of the cause. Families who'd lost loved ones to diseases linked to PFAS exposure now had evidence that those deaths were preventable and that specific entities were responsible. Environmental advocates who'd been fighting for years for stronger regulations suddenly had proof of why those regulations had been blocked. And journalists had a story that connected corporate malfeasance, government corruption, and public health disaster in ways that were impossible to ignore. Within a week, congressional hearings were being scheduled, the EPA's Inspector General had opened an investigation, and Vanguard Chemical Industries was facing dozens of lawsuits from affected communities. The institutional response to Rebecca's ordeal and leaked research varied dramatically depending on whose interests were threatened. UC Berkeley, after initially seeming uncertain about how to support a professor who'd been detained by federal agents, ultimately backed her fully once public opinion made any other response untenable. The university's statement emphasized academic freedom, scientific integrity, and Rebecca's exemplary research record, though critics noted this support came only after media attention made abandoning her politically costly. The EPA issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging concerns about past handling of certain enforcement matters while defending the overall integrity of their regulatory processes, a non-apology that satisfied no one but signaled recognition that heads would need to roll. Vanguard Chemical Industries issued aggressive denials, claiming Rebecca's research was scientifically unsound and motivated by anti-business ideology, but their credibility was undermined by their own leaked documents showing they'd known about the dangers for decades. The most significant response came from Congress, where representatives from both parties recognized that Rebecca's case represented something beyond partisan politics. This was about whether science and public health could be systematically suppressed to protect corporate profit. A bipartisan coalition formed to investigate the regulatory failures Rebecca had documented, and for once, the usual political divisions seemed less important than the fundamental question of governmental accountability. The hearings that followed were explosive, with EPA officials struggling to explain why enforcement actions had been delayed or dropped, and Vanguard executives invoking Fifth Amendment rights rather than answering questions about their own internal documents. Rebecca herself testified, providing calm, detailed explanation of her research methodology, her findings, and the pressure campaign that had been waged to silence her. Her testimony was compelling not because it was emotional or dramatic, but because it was scientifically rigorous and impossible to refute. The legal aftermath of Rebecca's leaked research created precedents that would affect corporate environmental liability for years. Multiple class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of affected communities, seeking compensation for health damages and cleanup of contamination. Several of these suits succeeded, with Vanguard ultimately settling for amounts exceeding $2 billion, a significant penalty that actually hurt their bottom line, unlike the nominal fines they'd been paying for decades. More importantly, the lawsuits established legal precedents about corporate responsibility for long-term environmental contamination, making it harder for companies to claim ignorance or hide behind regulatory permissions when their own documents showed they'd known about dangers. Criminal charges were filed against several Vanguard executives for environmental crimes and conspiracy to defraud regulatory agencies, though whether those charges would result in actual prison time remained uncertain given the tendency of white-collar criminals to avoid serious consequences. The regulatory reforms triggered by Rebecca's research were substantial, if not entirely sufficient. The EPA implemented new rules requiring public disclosure of industry-funded studies related to chemical safety, addressing the problem of companies suppressing research that showed their products were dangerous. Several states, including California, passed legislation creating independent oversight boards to review decisions by environmental agencies, reducing the risk of regulatory capture. And perhaps most significantly, Congress passed the Environmental Research Protection Act, which created legal protections for scientists whose research threatened powerful interests, making it harder to use national security claims or other pretexts to suppress legitimate scientific findings. These reforms didn't solve all the problems Rebecca had identified, but they represented real progress toward a system where truth and public health could compete more effectively against corporate profit. Rebecca Chen's professional life after her detention and the release of her research was complex. She'd become a hero to environmental advocates and a symbol of scientific courage, but she'd also become a target for corporate interests and their political allies who portrayed her as an activist rather than a scientist. Her research continued to be cited and replicated by other scientists, confirming her findings and extending them to other contaminated sites across the country. She received awards from scientific organizations recognizing her integrity and courage. But she also faced ongoing harassment, death threats from corporate-aligned extremists, and professional challenges from a scientific establishment that was often uncomfortable with researchers who became public figures. Rebecca handled these contradictions with the same methodical approach she brought to her research, acknowledging the costs while staying focused on the work that mattered. 3 years after her detention, Rebecca published a book titled Poisoned: How Science, Profit, and Power Collude Against Public Health. The book expanded on her research, telling the full story of what she'd discovered and how she'd been targeted for discovering it. More importantly, it contextualized her case within the broader pattern of scientific suppression that occurs when research threatens powerful economic interests. Rebecca documented dozens of other cases where scientists had faced retaliation for findings that challenged corporate profit. Tobacco researchers who'd established smoking's link to cancer, climate scientists who'd proven human-caused warming, pharmaceutical researchers who'd found safety problems with profitable drugs. The pattern was consistent. Industries facing accountability used their economic power to suppress science, capture regulatory agencies, and destroy careers of scientists who wouldn't be silenced. Rebecca's book became a bestseller and a rallying point for movements demanding stronger protections for scientific integrity and independence. The communities that had been poisoned by Vanguard Chemicals' contamination slowly began the long process of healing and rebuilding, though the forever nature of PFAS chemicals meant that full recovery would take generations. Cleanup efforts were funded by settlement money, though removing PFAS from soil and water was technically challenging and incredibly expensive. Health monitoring programs were established for affected residents, and medical trusts were created to pay for treatment of diseases linked to exposure. These measures couldn't undo the damage, couldn't bring back loved ones who died from preventable cancers, couldn't reverse developmental problems in children exposed in utero, couldn't restore the decades of life lived in ignorance of the poison in their water. But they represented accountability and recognition, acknowledgement that what had happened to these communities was wrong and that those responsible had to pay some price, even if that price could never fully compensate for harm done. Rebecca's story became a case study used in universities teaching scientific ethics, environmental law, and public policy. Students analyzed what she'd done right, maintaining rigorous methodology, documenting everything, building networks of support, creating insurance against suppression. They also discussed the impossible position she'd been put in, where doing ethical science and protecting public health required accepting professional risk and personal danger. The case raised uncomfortable questions about how scientific research should operate in a society where powerful interests had incentive and ability to suppress findings they didn't like. Should scientists be expected to risk their careers and safety to publish true findings? What responsibility did universities and scientific institutions have to protect researchers facing retaliation? And how could society create systems where truth didn't require such extraordinary courage to defend? The deeper implications of Rebecca Chen's experience extend beyond environmental science to fundamental questions about how democracy functions when truth becomes politically inconvenient or economically threatening. Rebecca had discovered that a major corporation was poisoning communities and that government agencies meant to protect public health were complicit in covering it up. The mechanisms used to suppress her research, national security claims, intimidation, seizure of materials, detention without charges, were all technically legal or at least operated in legal gray areas where authority was assumed even if its legitimacy was questionable. This revealed something troubling, that in America, despite constitutional protections for free speech and scientific inquiry, powerful interests could still effectively suppress truth if they were willing to use the tools available to them. The only reason Rebecca's research ultimately came to light was because she'd anticipated suppression and created workarounds, but requiring that level of sophistication and courage from every scientist whose work threatened power was neither sustainable nor democratic. If you take one lesson from Rebecca Chen's story, let it be this: truth doesn't protect itself, and the systems we've created to discover and share truth are far more fragile than we'd like to believe. Rebecca's research was rigorous, peer-reviewed, and undeniably true, but that truth would have been successfully buried if she hadn't taken extraordinary precautions and accepted enormous personal risk. Her story shows that scientific integrity and public health protection require constant vigilance and courage, that regulatory agencies can be captured by the interests they're supposed to regulate, and that exposing wrongdoing by powerful entities will be met with retaliation no matter how righteous your cause. But her story also shows that truth can survive suppression attempts if people are willing to fight for it, that individual courage can trigger systemic change, and that even the most powerful cover-ups can ultimately be exposed when scientists prioritize public welfare over personal safety. Here's what you can do right now. First, support scientific research and researchers, particularly those working on topics that threaten corporate interests: environmental science, public health, consumer safety. These researchers face unique pressures and need institutional backing. Second, demand transparency from regulatory agencies and hold them accountable when they fail to protect public health. Third, learn about environmental contamination in your own community. PFAS and other forever chemicals aren't just California's problem. They're contaminating water supplies nationwide. And finally, remember that every time you hear about research being suppressed or scientists being intimidated, it's not just about that one case. It's about a system where profit regularly takes precedence over truth and health. If Rebecca Chen's story made you angry, worried, or inspired you to demand better, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into stories that expose how power operates and how ordinary people fight back. Share this video with anyone who cares about environmental protection, scientific integrity, or holding corporations accountable. Drop a comment telling us about environmental issues in your community or sharing your thoughts on how we protect science from political and economic pressure. Because Rebecca proved that one person with courage and evidence can take on massive institutions and win, but she shouldn't have had to do it alone, and the next scientist in her position needs all of us backing them up before they're forced to choose between their safety and the truth.